In this second PowerPoint about sex and gender, we're going to try to answer a very hard question. This inequality we see worldwide between men and women to different degrees, where does it come from? First, it is very important to see the difference between the private sphere and the public sphere of society. The public sphere is linked with all these activities that happen outside of the immediate family, outside home. It can be linked with politics, power, trade, economy, religion, ritual, and the military, for example. This public sphere traditionally is linked with men's work, whereas women tend to dominate what we call the private sphere, everything that surrounds home and taking care of the immediate family. Since activities linked with the public sphere, linked with politics, with the development of the economy, education, ritual, trade, war, since these activities are seen as good for the well-being of the state, as seen as useful for the good of everyone, these activities are important. So they help raising the status of those who perform these activities. And activities linked with the private sphere are very good for the well-being of the family, but not for the well-being of the state or the society. So these activities are considered less socially important. They don't give status to those who perform them. So if we go back to our question, how can we explain the origins of male dominance around the world? Where does this come from, this gender inequality? I will give three explanations. The one that was very popular until the 19th century, the social Darwinist explanation, is the first one, and it is not used today. It's totally rejected. I explained it because it was in use during the 19th century. I will also explain the evolutionary psychology explanation that is still used today, and the anthropological explanation. The social Darwinist explanation that is totally rejected is based on the idea of social Darwinism. And I'm sure you remember from the last topic when we defined social Darwinism, it is the idea that some individuals in society are more socially fit. We have seen the link with race in the last topic, but there's more than that. And if we encourage the reproduction of these socially fit individuals that are wealthy, that have no mental health issues, that have positions in society, etc. If we encourage the reproduction of these individuals, the society would evolve. So in the social Darwinist explanation, societies are considered as evolving. And if we discourage the reproduction of individuals that are less or not socially fit, it will lead to the same results. This theory is wrong because it is very unethical. First, societies do not evolve. They change, they get more complex, but it's really tricky to judge if a society evolves or not. Also, people should be free to manage their own reproduction. So, and it's not correct to say that some people in society should not reproduce, and we should not control human reproduction. So, if this idea is unethical, but it was used to explain why man should be on top of the social hierarchy. According to the social Darwinist explanation, being socially fit means having a patrilineal descent as a culture and having women subordinated to men. These two criteria that are very important for us here were considered as signs of social fitness and as signs of, oh, these people should reproduce. They are the ones who are going to make societies evolve. So if we link it with gender, along with patrilineal descent and the subordination of women, men who were considered socially fit were those who were active in the public sphere, those who had a paid work that were linked with the advancement of trade, the economy, the political system, etc. And women who were considered socially fit were those who were freed from productive labor, who were not performing any task in the public sphere, who were totally devoted to their home and their children and their immediate family. So these women were the fit women who would be very useful for the so-called evolution of society. And this link with women and the private sphere, this link with freeing women from productive labor, was considered to be linked with their inferior mental capabilities. So to conclude the social Darwinist explanation, women who were socially fit were staying home. They were taking care of their immediate family, and they did not need to be as good as men or equal to men when it comes to mental capabilities or intelligence. These women were not as intelligent as men, so they were fit home. It was their place. So the society could evolve. Now you see why this social Darwinist explanation is rejected today. The evolutionary psychology explanation that is still in use today, that is accepted in the scientific community, is based on the fact that biological functions of women in reproduction place them at a disadvantage when it's time to gain some social power. Women are the ones who get pregnant, who give birth, who has to take care of very young children by breastfeeding, by caring a lot. So these are all biological functions. We cannot fight this. And throughout history, these functions kept them closer to home. I will explain what we call the man-the-hunter theory and food for sex hypothesis that go together. So the theory starts like this. Very far in time, a long time ago, millions of years ago, scientists don't know how it started, but at some point in the biological evolution of primates, now I'm not talking about the Homo genius, and especially not about Homo sapiens, this is very recent, but in the biological evolution of primates, at some point, sex became regulated. Individuals started to put some rules around it. Sex became an activity that was done year-round. Other animals have seasons, but primates, and especially great apes, can reproduce year-round. And this happened at some point in primate evolution. And later on, with the evolution of hominids and then Homo, sex became very more regulated, and the concept of what we could call some sort of family emerged. We don't know when it happened, but it did happen in the evolution of hominids. Family here, what I mean is long-term bonding between male and female, and the development of mechanisms, of social mechanisms, that would allow males to be sure they really were the father of the children they were providing for. So this is how this early idea of family might have emerged in the prehistory of hominids, in the evolution of hominids. And this evolutionary psychology explanation is based on the theory of natural selection. Now, I will not take time here to explain again the theory of natural selection, Darwin's natural selection, because you know it already. We have explained it in details in the first part of the semester, but it's based on it, okay? And these early hominids, these early Homo as well, were hunter-gatherers and they were foragers. This is known. This is the fact. During the major part of our prehistory, we were hunter-gatherers, we were foragers. And we assume, as you read everywhere, that men hunted and women gathered. This is mostly based on ethnographic analogy, on the observation of foraging societies that were around us until the 1960s. So we assume that men hunted and women gathered. It's not really a question of physical strength because women are totally able to hunt, they're strong enough. But it's mostly because of children. Women, if they have to give birth, if they're pregnant, if they have young children to take care of, it's not really convenient to hunt in this situation. So men were responsible for hunting and women were responsible of gathering food and firewood and other goods. And this was the gender division of labor. Being a good hunter, being a hunter that is successful, that will be healthy, well-fed, that will survive to a productive age and have healthy offspring who will survive in their turn. Being a good hunter requires certain traits. It requires being a little bit aggressive, being dominant, being risk-taking, having the ability to be away for a long time and be able to survive. These are all traits and skills linked with hunting. And gathering requires other kinds of skills. It does not require to be risk-taking and aggressive, and it requires to be patient, to be nurturing, to be cooperative. It's okay to be passive and be a good gatherer, or be healthy and have reproductive success. You can be closer to the camp. You don't have to take risks and be away for a long time. So all these patterns, all these skills and traits during hundreds and thousands of generations, after generations and generations of natural selection, would have become hardwired into the human brain. They would have become encoded into our DNA if more aggressive and dominant and powerful and risk-taking hunters got more offspring. Their offspring will look like them. And if more patient and nurturing gatherers got more offspring, the same thing would happen. So this is why I say that the theory of natural selection is used in the evolutionary psychology explanation as to why men have dominate women. And this gender division of labor, men hunting, women gathering, necessitated the sharing of food between men and women, men giving meat and women giving other kinds of food. And hominids were case selected. It means that our species produce few offspring, not one every year, and offspring are very dependent. They depend on their parents, especially their mother, during many, many years. We mature very slowly, and we have a very, very slow reproductive rate. It was the case, and it was even worse when we were foragers. So we cannot, as bands of hunter-gatherers, could not afford losing too many offspring because the survival of the band depended on them. So women needed to be very careful, to invest a lot of energy in caring children. Women were much more sedentary than men as well. So taking care of children required women to kind of be dependent on men to obtain meat, which was the most desirable food. So men provided meat for women and children, and the reward for that was sex. So this is how the theory works. The evolutionary psychology explanation has been criticized, as all theories are. Every time there's a theory that makes a link between behavioral traits or psychological traits, like being dominant, being nurturing, and the biological evolution of hominids is controversial because we don't know to what extent traits and behaviors are encoded into DNA. So anytime there's disconnection, it is controversial. But there's more criticism. The first one being the fact that we assume that men hunted and women gathered. We're not sure of it. It's based on ethnographic analogy. We cannot go back in time hundreds of thousands of years ago and see the gender division of labor. It does not leave traces. So yes, based on ethnographic analogy, men hunt, but it might be a myth. Women might have been more independent than we think in obtaining meat. Some women in Australia right now, Aboriginal women who still choose to be foragers, they can hunt. They're able, and they do hunt. The other criticism is the fact that we assume that men were main food providers and women depended on them. They were dependent, so they were subordinated. Maybe not. Even based on ethnographic analogy, on the observation of foraging populations today, and especially those before the 1960s, where they were more numerous, women typically are the main food providers in a band. They don't necessarily bring the most desirable food, meat and fat, but they are the main food providers. The major part of the calories consumed by members of the band come from gathering, come from women, gathering of insects, seeds, plants, etc. So women provide that. There is an exception. These are populations living up north where there is not a lot to gather. But at most places where people are foragers, women bring food home. The other critic comes from the assumption that women are not risk-taking individuals because they have to stay close to home for gathering. They're more sedentary than men. Maybe not. In many foraging societies, women are very mobile. They travel a lot on the territory to gather food. The other criticism is this kind of exchange between sex and meat. It's based on the assumption that men initiate sex and women are dependent on them to get meat. That's another maybe stereotype or myth, and it's criticized, this theory, because it is based on a lot of biological determinism. How we do act would be based a lot on biological factors, on how our DNA is hardwired. This is another problematic side of the theory. Now the third theory, the anthropological explanation as to why men have more power than women in societies. This explanation, this theory, takes the changes in subsistence strategies throughout time as a major source of inequality between men and women. To understand the theory, you have to remember how subsistence strategies got more complex, starting from foraging, transitioning with horticulture, and finally getting much more complex with agriculture. You remember that from last year. This slide here is a reminder. What is a foraging society? What is a band? A band is composed of hunter-gatherers. It's composed of an egalitarian group, so there's no institutionalized hierarchy. Some individuals can gain status throughout their lives, but it ends there. They're nomadic. Private property is unimportant. You have your weapons, your tools, your clothes, that's it. You don't want to carry too much private property. It's impossible. Very important, bands of foragers are peaceful societies. There's low conflict, and anytime a conflict happens, it's personal. It's not institutionalized. Something else that is important, there is no economic specialization in a band. Everyone is responsible for finding food, for hunting or gathering, and food is shared equally among all members of the band. So this is very, very important to remember. Interestingly, in a band, there is no public sphere. There is no such thing as military, or trade, or complex economy, or organized ritual. There is some sort of spirituality, but there is no institutionalized religion. There is no institutionalized political system. There is no chief. So there's no public sphere. There's no place for this very important inequality between men and women. And there's a very low birth rate in bands. Life is hard. Being a nomadic is not easy on your body. So typically birth rates are low. So women are not very bothered by their role of mothers, much less than in a complex society. And women contribute a lot to the subsistence and well-being of the group, as we have seen. Women bring a lot of food home from gathering. So women in bands of foragers enjoyed a status that was equal to men's. And it's still the case in foraging societies today. So there is no major difference between men and women when it's about status and I cannot say power, but status and recognition in society. So when students think that, oh, the inequality between men and women comes from a long time ago, where we were hunter-gatherers, according to the anthropological theory, it's not the case. The inequality developed later. The next step is horticulture, as a slow transition from foraging to agriculture. You remember all of that from last year, so I will not explain very long, but horticulture means a transition to food production. So cultivation of plants in gardens, there is no extensive field yet, no major change in the territory. People are still a little bit hunting and gathering. But people are now trans-egalitarian. So there is a transition to social hierarchy. They're not totally egalitarian anymore. And there is a transition in settlement as well. They're not totally nomadic. They're starting to be sedentary when people become horticulturalists. Maybe they're not sedentary year-round, but it is a transition here. So the concept of private property is emerging. There is now your garden, your house, your camp, your grain, it starts. There's a higher population. The birth rate may be increasing. There is competition between families, maybe between men for resources. We cannot talk about conflict, but yes, competition exists. And here, women still played a large role in subsistence in horticulturalist societies because there's very often a complementing with gathering, and women can play a role in cultivating a little bit. Now there's something new in horticulturalist societies. We see that with ethnographic analogy. More complex kinship systems emerge, what we call lineages in anthropology. The extended family becomes important because it's the emergence of farming. It's the first steps. And there are new concepts here. There is a little land. There's housing. There might be inheritance. There might be private property to pass on to the next generations. Now it depends on which horticulturalist society it is. Some very early horticulturalist societies did not have anything to pass or land or house because it was common housing. But some other horticulturalist societies, more developed, yes, had a great notion of private property, of land, of housing. And here, the status of women in horticulturalist societies really depends on the kinship system that is put in place. At most places of the world where horticulture emerged, patrilineal systems developed. And this is mostly the case where a surplus started to be produced. Now remember, from last year, surplus of food is a very important concept in the development of complex societies. A surplus of food was produced in places where resources were abundant enough, where the climate was good or stable, where the land was fertile. A surplus could be stored. Also, sometimes a surplus became necessary where resources were abundant, but the supply was not stable. It was not the same. The crops were not the same year after year. Sometimes they were droughts or floods or insects, or people needed to store surplus for their survival. So in such a case, the mode of subsistence favors competition because men want more surplus for themselves and for their families. So where this cohesion, this cooperation between men from the same family was favored, was necessary, patrilineal descent developed typically. Remember, in a patrilineal society, the identity is transmitted through the male line, the male bloodline. And typically, patrilineal societies were patrilocal, so women marry out. In a residence group, all men are related by blood, but not women. So this system favors more social cohesion among men and favors the rise of status of men in the family. It gives more power to men. On the other side, at some places in the world, matrilineal societies developed with horticulture. It developed in places where surplus was not produced. Either it was not necessary because the supply was stable year after year. You did not need to save food because anyways, the year after you would have another crop. Or the supply of food, the production of the land was not good enough, was not abundant. So it was impossible in this case to produce a surplus. In this case, there's no surplus to be, there's no need to defend your surplus of food because there's no surplus. So men did not need to stick together in the family to defend their food surplus. So matrilineal systems could develop here. There is less competition between men, so men did not need to be all related by blood on a land, in a household. More flexibility was allowed here. As I have said, in matrilineal societies, you remember, identity is transmitted through the female's line. Sometimes matrilineal societies are matrilocal, which means that men would marry out, not always, but sometimes. And it is possible when surplus is not produced, where men could be more mobile in a society. But even in matrilineal societies, men had more power than women. Women had a better status, a better position in matrilineal societies, but still men were above, because in any horticulturalist society, we see the emergence of the public sphere. Things get organized, and there's a little bit of an economic system here. There's a surplus. There can be trade, so this beneficiates men. There's a kinship system now to take care of. Things get more organized. Politics get more organized with competition between families, with the rise of private property. It's mine, so I have power. So we see with horticulturalist society the first emergence of what we could call a public sphere. And horticulture eventually led to the development of agriculture in human societies. You remember that agriculture means intensive food production, total dependence on food production, so no more hunting, no more gathering, intensive cultivation techniques, high technology, deforestation, the use of draft animals, plows, terracing, irrigation, etc. And agriculture had major consequences on human societies. And these consequences were linked with the rise of inequality between men and women. Some consequences of agriculture were settled life, the emergence of permanent villages, the accumulation of private property, of wealth, that is a new notion in human societies. This beneficiated men because men typically own private property, especially in patrilineal systems, because now we have complex lineages, complex kinship systems. Also, agriculture is linked with the transformation of the landscape, with irrigation, with terracing, with this huge, massive work done on the land, and men are responsible of performing these hard tasks. This is linked with the physical capabilities of men. We have seen this physical inequality. Also, it's linked with the development of trade, of traveling away. This is linked with the work of men as well. Agriculture was also linked with the development of warfare, of large-scale conflict, and these are linked with men usually. It's linked with the development of a new division of labor that includes the development of different professions, of technology, and this is linked with the work of men as well, who will work outside the home, the house. It's linked with the development of a complex social hierarchy with the emergence of chiefs, and this is linked with men as well. The development of new ideologies appear that will kind of justify the position of men on top of the social hierarchy. So the development of agriculture was linked with a much bigger gap between the private and public sphere. So the status of women stayed the same, remained the same, because the private sphere did not change. It's taking care of the immediate family. But the role of men changed a lot because it is linked with the public sphere. Men, for various reasons, linked with their role in the reproduction of the biological reproduction that is not so important, takes less time. Men took advantage of this development of the public sphere, so they took their place in technology, in the division of labor, in the new ideologies, in the new social kinship organization. In all these aspects, we have seen that are consequences of agriculture are closely linked with the development of the public sphere. So it helped a lot men rising their status and their power in society, whereas women lost their productive role in subsistence economy. They got stuck in the private sphere, and this did not change. And as I said, at the same time, ideologies developed to justify the women's subordination, the inferiority of women. Great religions, major religions we live with today, were not developed before agriculture. They were developed after, and they were mostly developed by men. And agriculture eventually led to the rise of the first states in the world. We call them civilizations, but in anthropology, it is the state. And a state, remember, it's a very complex political entity that is linked with the further development of the public sphere, the further development of social classes, of politics with a central government, of trade with now long-distance trade, of conflict, now a war and organized military, the further development of official religions, of taxes, sciences, a very complex division of labor. All these aspects of state that developed further, those aspects that were started with agriculture, are linked with the public sphere and contributed to an even bigger gap between the public and private sphere, an even bigger gap between the status of men and women, because in early states women did not change their status. They remained linked with the private sphere. These aspects of the public sphere linked with the development of agriculture and then the state, like higher education, official religion, long distance trade, army, war, politics, central government, these things are seen as valuable work because it serves the interest of the whole society, the interest of the state. It's done for the good of all. So it raises the status of those who perform these tasks in society. It raises the status of men. Whereas the work performed by women in the domestic world, in the private sphere, is not seen as so valuable because it only serves the interest of the immediate family. It doesn't raise the status of those who perform these tasks in the private sphere. So the status of women never really increased with the development of complex subsistence systems and complex societies. The anthropological theory to explain the difference in status and power between men and women has been criticized as well, mostly because it is considered as putting too much importance to subsistence, to the environment, to the cultural environment around, as the explanation for the inequality between gender, as if everything was linked with the subsistence system. This is the main critics. So throughout prehistory and history, from foraging to the development of horticulture, then agriculture, then the rise of the state, then the rise of the industrial state later on, throughout this time, the status of women has not improved, and the status of men rose tremendously with the development of the public sphere. So the gap in power between men and women got much, much bigger. And things are changing, things have been changing recently in some countries. And this new change is linked with what we call the dependency theory in sociology and anthropology. The dependency theory states that the tremendous economic development of the wealthy countries of the world, of the core countries, has required the exploitation of periphery countries, of countries that we call the third world countries now. Economies, societies of these periphery countries have been distorted to serve the interests and the needs of what we call today developed nations. It comes from colonization in the 15th, 16th century, the exploitation of human labor, the exploitation of resources in periphery countries. So wealth was and is extracted. When I talk about wealth, I'm talking about human labor and actual wealth, material wealth. Goods, resources were extracted, still are extracted, and are by developing nations to support the needs of their populations. So the fact that women now are rising their status in society, this only happens in core countries. It does not happen so much in periphery countries. On this map, you see, for example, core countries in North America, in the western part of Europe, in Oceania, Japan, and you see periphery countries in white. These are the poorest countries in the world, where the status of women is not increasing so much, whereas the status of women in core countries is improving tremendously. And this is due to the consequences of colonization that happened in the past and the exploitation, distortion of local economies in periphery countries. So in periphery countries, in what we call dependent nations, there is typically a very high population growth. There are big families. There are low standards of living. People still live in poverty much more. The sexual division of labor is more visible when there is an opportunity to get a high education, to get an education or high education, it's given to men. So men can be integrated to the global economy, to the workforce, to capitalist work. And this is not a possibility for women because of poverty, because there's no opportunities for educating women in poor countries, independent, in periphery nations. So women will stay in the domestic realm. They will stay in the private sphere of society. Their task is essential because they have to raise their children and to maintain this labor force that is done by men, but their social status is not improving. When they uh, when they have a job or an occupation outside of the private sphere, it's a low-paid job. It is an insecure. It's an unregulated work that will not increase their financial independence so much. So women who work in periphery countries, for example, they will sell food on the street, they will work in the house of wealthy families, they will work in sweatshops. These are not, there's are low paying jobs, these are insecure jobs. They are the first to lose their jobs when the economy goes down. So women do not raise their status right now so much in periphery countries. And this is a consequence of the past and the present exploitation of the resources from these countries by wealthy nations. And in core countries, in developed nations, women have a much better status. They are changing this, they're gaining back this power they lost throughout history because of wealth, because their country can afford it, because they do have access to healthcare, they do have access to education, to higher education, and they do have access to the global economy, to the formal economy. They have access to financial independence. So this is a major help in raising their status. And this only happens right now to a large extent in core nations, in developed nations. Even if women are rising their status a lot in developed nations, the work is not totally done. Women are still the ones associated with the private sphere of society. They're still the ones taking care of the immediate family, taking care of the children, even if things are slowly changing.